They didn't destroy me because I was weak. They destroyed me because I stood out. That night in Manhattan was supposed to be the beginning of everything I had worked for, a promotion, a future, a name that finally meant something. I was 26, carrying student debt, 2 part-time jobs, and a belief that effort always mattered more than privilege. But I learned that night how quickly belief can collapse when power decides it no longer has use for you. It happened inside the glass tower of a private charity gala, where everyone smiled too easily and spoke too carefully. Emily Carter stood near the edge of the room holding a tray of untouched champagne. She was no longer allowed to serve. Weeks of whispers had already circled her name. Too different, too visible, too unwilling to shrink herself to fit expectations. Tonight that difference became a target she could not outrun. When the announcement came, it was not subtle, not private, not kind. Her entire department turned toward her, as if someone had pulled the air out of the room. There was no accusation spoken. Only the silence that follows a decision already made. Emily felt it before she understood it. The shift, the judgment, the quiet removal of everything she thought she had earned. Her hands tightened on the tray, not because it was heavy, but because it suddenly felt like proof of something she could not name. And then the second silence arrived, heavier than the first, as a message appeared on every screen in the room. No one spoke when the words betrayed for being too big appeared in the internal system log beside her employee profile. She did not need anyone to explain what it meant. Because in corporate language, silence like that was never accidental. Across the room, a man in a dark tailored suit observed everything without moving. Vincent Moretti did not raise his voice, did not interrupt, did not react like anyone else in the room expected him to. He simply watched her as if the moment had already been decided long before she arrived. The kind of attention he gave was not curiosity, it was recognition. And for the first time that night, Emily Carter realized she was no longer part of the room. She stood in. She was something being evaluated, measured, and quietly moved toward an outcome she could not yet see. When she finally stepped out into the cold air outside the building, the city felt unfamiliar, even though she had walked those streets 100 times. Her phone buzzed once, then again, but she did not answer it. Because something deeper than fear told her that everything she knew had already shifted. And somewhere beyond the glass doors behind her, Vincent Moretti made a quiet decision that would change the direction of both their lives. She did not know it yet, but being labeled as too big was not about her voice or her presence, but about the people who feared what she might become if she was no longer controllable. And that fear had already reached someone who never ignored opportunity when it appeared. Vincent Moretti had always believed that silence was the most expensive thing a person could own. And he intended to buy the cold air outside the building should have felt like relief, but instead it felt like distance, as if the city had quietly stepped back from her and decided not to recognize her anymore. Emily Carter stood on the sidewalk with her arms folded tightly across herself, watching reflections of passing headlights stretch across the wet pavement like broken pieces of a life she could no longer reach. Her phone kept vibrating in her hand, each notification another reminder that the version of her that existed inside the building a few minutes ago was already being rewritten, without her consent. She did not open any of them. She already knew what they would say in different words: apologies without meaning, explanations without ownership, silence disguised as professionalism. Behind the glass doors, the world she had worked for continued moving without her, untouched, uninterrupted, unchanged. That realization hurt more than the dismissal itself because it confirmed what she had always refused to believe. That belonging was never guaranteed. It was conditional, and she had just lost the conditions. A black vehicle slowed at the curb across the street, its presence too deliberate to be random, too still to belong to ordinary traffic. Emily noticed it without wanting to, the way people notice storms before they arrive. The back window lowered slightly, revealing nothing at first except darkness inside, but she felt it immediately, the weight of attention, steady and controlled. When the passenger door finally opened, Vincent Moretti stepped out without urgency. He did not look at the building, did not look at the crowd, did not look at anything except her. The distance between them felt smaller than it should have, even though several lanes of traffic separated them. Emily straightened instinctively, Not out of courage but out of awareness that something about this moment had already been decided before she was invited into it. Vincent stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable, his presence quiet in a way that made the noise of the city feel unnecessary. When he spoke, his voice did not carry pressure, only certainty. He said he had watched what happened inside, not with judgment, but with understanding that made her feel strangely exposed. As if the room had not ended when she left it. Emily told him she did not need help, that she could handle her own life, that whatever he thought he saw was not his concern. He listened without interruption, as if her words were something he had already accounted for. Then he asked a question that did not match the situation at all, asking not about what she lost, but about what she was willing to become if she stopped trying to fit into places that removed her so easily. The question unsettled her more than the dismissal ever had because it did not sound like sympathy. It sounded like recognition. Around them, the city continued moving, unaware that a different kind of decision was being made in the quiet space between two strangers. Emily felt the instinct to walk away, to return to something familiar, even if it no longer existed in the same way. But when she shifted her weight, Vincent did not stop her, did not block her, did not reach for her. Instead, he simply said that doors like the one she had just walked out of rarely stayed closed for people like her unless something stronger replaced them. And in that moment, Emily understood that what frightened her was not him, but the possibility that he was not offering escape, but replacement, and that somewhere between fear and curiosity, the line she trusted most was already starting to blur. The silence between them did not feel empty, it felt structured, as if every passing second was being measured by something she could not see. Emily Carter stood on the sidewalk with her arms still folded, but the cold air no longer felt like the only pressure around her. It was the presence of Vincent Moretti that created a different kind of weight, not physical, but undeniable, like standing too close to something that understood outcomes before decisions were made. The city continued moving behind them, taxis passing, lights reflecting off wet asphalt, people walking without noticing the exchange that was quietly changing the direction of her life. Emily forced herself to hold his gaze, because looking away felt like agreement she had not given. She told him again that she did not need help, that what happened inside the building was just corporate politics, nothing more than misunderstandings dressed as professionalism. Vincent did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied her the way people study weather patterns before storms, not with fear, but with calculation. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational, as if they were discussing something ordinary like time or distance. He said that people who were removed quietly were never removed without reason, and that reason was usually power disguised as etiquette. Emily felt a tightening in her chest, not from fear of him, but from recognition of how easily he understood what she had been trying not to name. She asked him why he was still standing there, why someone like him would care about a stranger standing outside a building that had just erased her. For the first time, something almost like curiosity crossed his expression. He told her that he did not usually involve himself in situations without purpose, but sometimes purpose arrived before permission. A black vehicle idled a few steps behind him, engine running quietly, waiting without urgency. He did not look back at it. When he gestured slightly toward it, only offering her a simple choice, not framed as pressure, but as possibility, he said she could remain where she was and attempt to rebuild inside a system that had already decided she was inconvenient. Or she could step into a different kind of structure where decisions were not disguised as accidents. Emily did not move. Her instincts told her to reject everything he represented, to turn away from the implication that her life required intervention from someone she did not know. But another part of her, quieter and more exhausted, recognized the truth she had been avoiding for years, that effort alone did not guarantee fairness. Vincent did not rush her. He simply waited, hands relaxed, posture controlled, as if patience was not a strategy but a certainty. When she finally asked what he expected from her, his answer was not immediate ownership, not demand, not control. He said he expected nothing she had not already been forced to give away in smaller pieces over time. Her trust, her name, her sense of belonging. The words did not feel like persuasion. They felt like observation. A distant sound of thunder rolled across the skyline. Though the rain had not yet returned, and Emily realized that the moment she stepped forward or stepped away would not change the fact that something irreversible had already begun. She looked at the building one last time, at the glass windows that reflected nothing of her presence, and for the first time she did not feel anger, only distance. When she turned back, Vincent had already opened the passenger door of the vehicle, not closing the space between them, but offering it without force. And in that quiet opening, Emily understood that some choices were not about escape or surrender, but about which unknown future you were willing to survive first. Emily Carter did not realize how heavy a single step could feel until she finally moved toward the open door of the black vehicle. It was not a dramatic movement, not a surrender, not a decision announced to the world, but something smaller, quieter, almost unnoticeable, like choosing to stop standing in the rain after convincing yourself you deserved it. The interior of the car was warmer than the night air, but the warmth did not feel comforting at first. It felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a place designed without her permission. Vincent Moretti did not speak as she entered. He simply waited until she was seated, until the door closed softly behind her, sealing out the sound of the city. The driver did not turn around, did not acknowledge her presence, only adjusted the mirror slightly and merged into traffic as if her arrival had always been part of the route. Emily kept her hands in her lap, forcing herself not to look too closely at anything, though everything inside the vehicle felt intentional, from the quiet hum of the engine to the clean lines of the interior that suggested discipline rather than decoration. Vincent sat beside her, not invading her space, but occupying it with a calm certainty that made silence feel structured instead of empty. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The city passed outside like blurred light, street lamps stretching into long reflections across the windows. Emily finally asked where they were going, her voice steadier than she expected. Vincent did not answer immediately. When he did, he said it was not a place she needed to understand yet, only a place where she would not be ignored. The answer should have frustrated her, but instead it unsettled her in a different way, because it implied that being ignored was something he had already observed happening to her before she even realized it herself. She turned her head slightly, studying him now instead of the window, noticing details she had refused to acknowledge earlier. The controlled stillness of his posture, the way he did not check his phone, the absence of distraction in someone who clearly had power over time itself. Emily asked him what he wanted from her, expecting something direct, something transactional, something she could argue against. Vincent finally looked at her fully, and for a brief moment, she felt as if the question had been waiting for her longer than she had been aware of it. He said he did not collect people the way others collected assets, that what he saw was not ownership, but potential structure in a world that had already failed to contain her. The words were careful, almost clinical, but there was something underneath them that she could not translate into comfort or threat. The vehicle slowed as they entered a quieter part of the city, streets wider, buildings more distant, lights fewer but more deliberate. Emily noticed the change before Vincent explained it, that they were leaving the places where she could disappear into crowds and entering spaces where people were expected to be remembered. She asked him if she was supposed to feel safe. Vincent considered the question for a moment, and said safety was not something he offered or withheld. It was something that depended on whether she understood the rules of the place she had just entered. Emily leaned back slightly, watching the passing skyline, realizing that nothing about her life from the past few hours had been accidental, not the dismissal, not the encounter outside the building, not even the silence that followed. Everything felt connected now in a way she could not yet map, like pieces of a system she had unknowingly stepped inside. As the car finally slowed near a gated entrance she could not yet see clearly, Vincent said quietly that once she stepped out, there would be no version of the day where she returned to being invisible again. And for the first time since the night began, Emily did not know if that was a warning or an offer. The car slowed to a complete stop in front of a gated entrance that rose higher than Emily Carter expected, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt final in a way she could not immediately explain. The metal gates were not threatening in appearance, yet their stillness suggested a boundary that was rarely crossed without intention. Soft lighting lined the pathway beyond, illuminating a long drive that disappeared into a property she could not yet fully see. Emily remained seated for a moment after the vehicle stopped, her hand still resting in her lap, unsure whether stepping out meant entering something she could reverse, or something already decided long before she arrived. Vincent Moretti exited the car first without urgency, as if time did not press against him the way it pressed against everyone else. He did not open her door immediately, not out of neglect, but out of expectation that she would choose her own movement. When she finally stepped out, the air felt different, quieter, removed from the noise of the city, as if sound itself had been filtered before reaching this place. The gates opened without visible command, and the vehicle rolled forward into the property with a controlled ease that made Emily realize this was not a residence that reacted to requests, but one that operated on established recognition. She followed Vincent along the path, her steps slower than his, not because she hesitated physically, but because she was trying to process the absence of uncertainty around him. Everything here felt prepared, not improvised, as if her arrival had been accounted for in advance without needing her permission. The main structure came into view, not overwhelming in design, but deliberate in presence, built with clean architectural lines that suggested order rather than display. Emily asked quietly where she was, and Vincent replied that it was simply a place where decisions were not left unfinished. The answer did not clarify anything, but it shifted her understanding in a subtle way, because it suggested that whatever existed here was not meant to be temporary. Inside, the atmosphere changed again, not warmer or colder, but more controlled. There were no crowds, no visible chaos, only a sense of quiet coordination, like a system that operated without needing to announce itself. A man in formal attire approached briefly, acknowledged Vincent with a slight nod, and then disappeared without looking at Emily for more than a second. That moment alone told her more than any explanation could have, because it confirmed she was not being treated as a guest in the conventional sense, but as something being observed within a structure that already understood its own hierarchy. Vincent guided her into a room that overlooked the city from a distance she had never experienced before. The glass walls revealed lights scattered across the skyline like fragments of a world she used to belong to but no longer fully occupied. Emily asked him again what this place meant for her specifically, and Vincent finally turned toward her completely, his expression steady but not cold. He told her that what happened to her earlier was not an isolated decision, but part of a pattern that repeated itself when people became inconvenient to systems that relied on silence. He said he did not intervene out of charity, but out of recognition that silence always attracted the wrong kind of attention when left unprotected. Emily felt her frustration rise, but beneath it was something more complicated, a reluctant understanding that nothing about her situation had been random. Vincent continued, saying that she would not be forced into anything, but she would also not be returned to a place that had already erased her once without consequence. The words were not threatening, yet they removed the illusion of easy escape. Emily looked away from the city outside, realizing that every version of her life she had planned before this night no longer fit inside the reality she was standing in. And as Vincent remained silent beside her, she understood that whatever came next would not be decided by fear alone, but by whether she could accept that some doors did not close behind her. They simply changed. What she was allowed to walk back into the interior of the residence felt less like a home, and more like a place where decisions were made in silence, and then carried out without interruption. Emily Carter stood near the center of the room, still adjusting to the fact that the world outside the glass walls now felt distant, almost irrelevant, as if it belonged to a different version of her life that no longer had direct access. Vincent Moretti remained nearby, not close enough to make her feel cornered, but not far enough to feel absent. The balance between distance and presence was deliberate, and Emily was beginning to understand that nothing in his world happened without intention. A soft notification sound came from a nearby device, followed by a subtle movement from Vincent as he glanced at the screen, acknowledging information without breaking the flow of the moment. He turned back to her and asked if she was hungry, not as a gesture of hospitality, but as a baseline assessment, like checking if someone had the capacity to process anything further. Emily hesitated before answering that she was not sure. The truth was that her body had not caught up with her situation, and everything felt suspended between exhaustion and disbelief. Vincent nodded once, then gestured toward a long corridor where light filtered through evenly spaced fixtures, creating a rhythm that guided movement rather than demanded it. As they walked, Emily noticed that there were no unnecessary sounds, no clutter, no visible signs of disorder. It was not luxury that defined the space, but precision, as if everything had been arranged to eliminate unpredictability. She finally asked him again what exactly this place was meant to be for her. And this time Vincent slowed his pace slightly, acknowledging the weight of the question. He explained that people like her, meaning those who became inconvenient to structured environments, often disappeared in ways that looked accidental on paper, but were intentional in practice. He did not raise his voice or dramatize the statement, he simply presented it as fact, like something he had seen repeat too many times to question its pattern. Emily felt a tightening in her chest, not from fear of him, but from the implication that her experience inside the previous building had not been unique, but predictable. They stopped near a wide doorway that opened into a private study overlooking the city from a different angle than before. Vincent entered first, then paused, allowing her to decide whether to follow. When she did, he did not comment on it. Instead, he moved toward a desk and placed a thin folder on its surface, sliding it forward without urgency. Emily did not touch it immediately. She asked what it was, and Vincent replied that it contained context, not instructions. That distinction made her pause. She opened it carefully and found documents that referenced her employment history, internal reviews, and communications she had never been aware were being observed in detail. There was no emotional commentary attached, only structured information that painted a clearer picture than she had ever seen of her own professional decline inside the system she had trusted. Vincent explained that what happened earlier was not about her performance alone, but about how organizations respond when individuals become too visible in ways that cannot be easily controlled or redirected. Emily looked up from the folder, trying to process how much of her recent life had already been interpreted by someone outside her awareness. Vincent did not move closer, but his voice softened slightly as he said that understanding the pattern was the first step to breaking it, not by force, but by repositioning oneself outside of environments that depended on quiet compliance. Emily closed the folder slowly, not because she agreed, but because she needed a moment to separate information from identity. The city outside the window continued to move, lights shifting across buildings like a living system unaware of individual disruption. Vincent remained still, allowing silence to settle between them without pressure to fill it. And in that silence, Emily realized that the choice in front of her was not simply about trust or fear, but about whether she was willing to accept that the life she had been trying to protect had already been rewritten long before she stepped into this room. Emily Carter had learned in her life that silence could either mean peace or control, and in that room overlooking the city, she could no longer tell the difference between the two. The folder still rested on the desk in front of her, untouched for a moment longer than necessary, as if acknowledging it would make the contents more real than she was ready to accept. Vincent Moretti stood near the window, his attention not on her directly, but on the city beyond the glass, as though he was measuring something larger than the present moment. Emily finally spoke, her voice quieter than she intended, asking why he was showing her all of this instead of simply letting her walk away like everyone else had done. Vincent did not turn immediately. When he did, his expression carried no surprise, only a calm recognition that the question was inevitable. He told her that walking away had already been an option she lost the moment she became visible in a system that did not tolerate unpredictability. The statement was not delivered as threat or persuasion, but as observation, which made it more difficult to dismiss. Emily looked down at the folder again, then asked him what he expected her to do with information she never asked to receive. Vincent walked a few steps closer, stopping at a distance that still respected space but eliminated isolation. He explained that most people try to return to what is familiar even when it no longer recognizes them, and that the real decision was not about acceptance, but about whether she was willing to stop negotiating with systems that had already decided her value. Emily felt a quiet frustration rise, not because she disagreed, but because part of what he said reflected truths she had avoided naming. She told him she was not afraid of starting over, only afraid of being placed into another situation where she had no control again. Vincent nodded slightly, as if that concern was expected. He replied that control was an illusion most environments sold as safety, and that real structure was not about removing choice, but about removing uncertainty. The words lingered in the air between them longer than expected, and Emily realized that nothing he said sounded like persuasion in the traditional sense. It sounded like a different framework entirely, one that did not rely on emotional appeal, but on redefining the conditions she had always assumed were fixed. She finally opened the folder again, this time with less hesitation, scanning details that mapped out not just her professional history, but patterns of decisions made around her without her awareness. It was not invasive in a chaotic sense, but precise, almost clinical, as if her life had been observed through layers she never knew existed. Emily asked quietly if he had been watching her before that night, and Vincent did not deny it. He said that awareness does not begin at the moment of interaction. It begins when patterns first appear worth understanding. The answer unsettled her more than any direct admission could have, because it removed randomness from her experience and replaced it with design. Emily closed the folder slowly, pressing her fingers against its edge as if grounding herself in something physical. She told him she did not know what kind of life he was suggesting, but she knew she could not simply disappear into another structure without understanding its cost. Vincent met her gaze fully now, and for the first time there was something in his expression that felt less like observation, and more like acknowledgement. He said that every structure had a cost, but the difference was whether that cost was hidden until it was too late or understood from the beginning. Outside the window, the city continued its endless movement, unaware of the quiet shift taking place behind glass and silence. Emily did not make a decision yet, but something inside her had already begun to change, not toward acceptance, but toward the realization that for the first time, someone was not asking her to fit into a system that would eventually erase her, but to consider stepping outside of it entirely. And that possibility was more disorienting than fear itself. Emily Carter stood by the window longer than she intended, watching the city stretch outward in layers of light and distance, as if it no longer belonged to the version of herself that had walked into this night believing effort alone could secure a future. The silence in the room behind her was no longer uncomfortable. It had become structured, almost intentional, as if even uncertainty had been accounted for within these walls. Vincent Moretti remained where she could feel his presence without needing to look directly at him. And that in itself felt like a different kind of pressure, not forceful, but steady enough to make avoidance impossible. Emily finally spoke without turning around, asking him what happens when someone chooses neither side. Neither the world she came from nor the one he was quietly presenting. There was a pause before he answered, not because he was uncertain, but because he treated the question as something that required precision. He said that choosing nothing was still a choice, and in systems like the one she had already experienced, hesitation was often interpreted as permission for others to decide in her place. Emily exhaled slowly, realizing that what exhausted her most was not fear, but the constant realization that every space she had ever occupied had already assigned her a role before she understood the rules. She turned back toward him, her voice quieter now, asking if he ever considered that people might not want to live inside structures they did not design, even if those structures claimed to protect them. Vincent met her gaze directly this time, and for the first time there was something less observational in his expression, something closer to acknowledgement shaped by experience rather than theory. He told her that most systems were not designed for comfort, they were designed for continuity, and continuity always prioritized stability over individual interpretation. Emily felt the weight of that idea settle in a way she could not easily dismiss, because it mirrored too closely what she had already lived through. She walked slowly back toward the desk, placing her hand on the edge of the folder again, not opening it, but grounding herself in its presence. She asked him if he expected her to simply accept that her previous life was already over. Vincent answered that acceptance was not required, only recognition. The distinction mattered more than she wanted it to, because recognition implied reality, not agreement. Emily lowered her gaze for a moment, then asked what role she was supposed to play in a world where she had no reference point. Vincent moved slightly closer, enough that his voice no longer needed to carry across distance. He said she was not being assigned a role. She was being given access to a reality that had always existed parallel to the one she knew, but rarely intersected with it in a visible way. Emily looked up at him, searching for manipulation or exaggeration, but found neither, only consistency. Outside, the city continued its quiet movement, unaware that anything had shifted inside this room. Emily asked one final question, her voice steady but carrying something newly exposed beneath it, asking why. Her. Vincent did not answer immediately, and when he did, it was not framed as destiny or sentiment. He said because she had already survived being removed without explanation. And people who survive that kind of silence either disappear completely or learn to see the structure behind it. The words did not comfort her, but they clarified something she had been circling without naming. Emily turned back toward the window again, not to escape the conversation, but to process it without interruption. For the first time since the night began, she did not feel like she was being pulled in a direction by external force, but instead standing at the edge of understanding that her life had already been operating under rules she never agreed to. Vincent did not move to fill the silence that followed. He simply allowed it to exist, as if waiting for her to notice that silence itself was no longer the absence of control, but the beginning of her awareness of it. The silence that followed felt different from all the silences that had come before it, because this one was no longer filled with uncertainty or pressure, but with recognition that something irreversible had already taken shape inside Emily Carter's understanding of her own life. She stood near the window without moving, her reflection layered over the distant city lights, and for the first time she did not feel like she was being evaluated by the space around her, but instead realizing she had been part of a system long before she ever noticed its boundaries. Vincent Moretti remained where he was, not closing distance, not creating it, simply existing within the same moment as if time itself had agreed to slow down for the weight of what was unfolding. Emily finally spoke without turning, her voice steady but no longer defensive, asking him what happens after recognition, after seeing the structure behind everything she thought was random. There was a pause, not of hesitation, but of precision, as if his answer required stripping away unnecessary meaning. Vincent said that recognition was not the end of uncertainty, but the beginning of responsibility, because once someone sees the pattern, they can no longer pretend it does not exist. Emily closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the idea not as philosophy, but as lived experience reflected back at her in a form she could not dismiss. She turned slowly toward him, asking if responsibility meant becoming part of something she did not choose. Vincent's expression remained calm, but there was a subtle shift in his attention, as if the question had finally reached the core of what he had been waiting for her to understand. He told her that choice was never removed, only reframed, and that every environment she had ever been in already contained invisible decisions made on her behalf, whether she agreed with them or not. Emily felt something inside her settle, not into comfort, but into clarity that was difficult to ignore. She walked a few steps away from the window, placing distance between herself and the illusion of escape it represented, and asked him directly what would change if she walked away right now. Vincent did not move closer, did not alter his tone. He simply said that nothing would change for him, but everything would return to what she already experienced before this night, only now with awareness of what she was stepping back into. The honesty of that answer carried more weight than any persuasion could have, because it did not promise improvement or consequence, only continuity. Emily looked down at her hands, realizing they were no longer shaking, and that realization itself unsettled her more than fear had. She asked quietly if he ever expected gratitude, and Vincent replied that expectation was irrelevant, because gratitude was an emotional response to surprise, and nothing about this situation had been accidental from his perspective. The statement should have created distance, but instead it created structure, something she could understand even if she did not fully accept it. Emily walked back toward the center of the room, no longer retreating, no longer advancing, simply occupying space with awareness she did not have before. She said she did not know what she was supposed to decide, because every option felt like a version of uncertainty shaped differently. Vincent finally stepped slightly closer, enough that the conversation no longer felt like it required projection across space. He told her she did not need to decide everything at once, only whether she was willing to stop being invisible inside systems that required her silence to function. Emily held his gaze for a long moment, and in that silence she realized that the question was not about him, or about the world he represented, but about whether she could accept that her life had already been shaped by forces she never named, and that stepping into awareness meant she could no longer pretend otherwise. Outside, the city continued its endless movement, unchanged and unaware. But inside the room something had stabilized into a form that was no longer uncertainty, but direction without clarity. And as Emily Carter finally exhaled slowly, she understood that whatever came next would not be defined by escape or captivity, but by the moment she chose to acknowledge that she had already crossed a threshold she could not unsee.